This video is part of a much larger analysis video of mouthwashing. If you like this video and are interested in seeing the bigger project, please watch to the end. Jimmy sexually assaulted Anya, and that is pretty much confirmed in the story. And yet it's still subtle, as I somehow didn't pick up on this fact during my playthrough, and had to look at comments on other videos to discover this. It's realistic, as Anya still has to sadly be near her abuser, which again is a reality for so many victims. It's not always easy to pick up on from an outsider's point of view, but Curly, well, he knew. He was, albeit indirectly, told this by Anya. One of the best conversations in the game is when Curly and Anya are talking about the moonlight screen 2 days before the crash. It's enlightening to say the least, and quite abstract, so I want to give my subjective opinion on what this scene means. Anya talks about how calming the moon picture is, but ultimately, it's not real. A facade. And in that beautiful, fake screen, she sees what she describes as a dead pixel. It's the ultimate reminder that this image she has in her head is just that. An image. A facade. It's not predicated on reality, but rather what the viewer wants to see. And in the back of her mind, Anya just can't get the thought of the dead pixel out of her mind, even though she wants to. Her subconscious, of course, has other plans, however. For me, the screen represents Jimmy. Anya talks so much in the game about our worst moments don't define us, and yet near the end of her life, she takes it back. She wanted to believe in it, but the dead pixel just kept obscuring the bigger picture. This dead pixel then would be Jimmy's assault, the action that reveals his entire image as a facade he fabricated. When she looks at Jimmy, even though she tries to not, all she sees is what he did to her. Rightfully so, obviously. The dude is a real piece of shit. But Curly doesn't see that. He doesn't see the dead pixel. His image of Jimmy is pure, incorruptible. I mean, he's known him for so long, right? All he sees, as he directly states, is the bigger picture, the facade. As he directly states, I don't think it ruins the illusion, though. Even when Anya asks why there are locks in the medbay and cockpit doors, but not the sleeping quarters, he simply responds with, safety. And that's just heart-shattering. Not all men are bad, but virtually all are, very importantly, complacent. They will defend their friends, even if those friends do bad things. Which means I lied. Almost our men are bad. I'm sorry if you're a man, as most of my audience is, and this alienates you. But you need to, as a man, look within yourself and introspect. Even if it wasn't something as bad as an assault, have you ever defended your shitty friends? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe it's no. I'm not sure. I don't know you or your friends. Also, obviously, women can do shitty things too, and then be defended by other women or even non-binary folks. But it's much less relevant. The facts, however, are this. Curly defends Jimmy. You can form your opinion on that, whatever it may be, whether or not he's a bad person, but I will say that it's complex. And yet, it's not. We need to condemn monstrous behavior, and yet we don't do it enough. We don't. We make jokes. We don't listen to victims enough. Curly is a complex character in his struggle, but that struggle itself is not that complex. The facts are that he knew Anya was pregnant with Jimmy's child, as she directly told him, and he knew that Jimmy sexually assaulted her, as she heavily insinuated and supported by him telling Jimmy that they can fix this. And the facts are, he kept him on the ship. Instead of helping Anya as much as possible, the victim, he instead went directly to his friend, to the abuser, and told him, we can figure this out. Jane Eyre is one of the greatest novels ever written, and I'm almost about to spoil the ending. Timestamp here to skip all that. In the book, at the end, Mr. Rochester is left disabled, completely reliant on Jane. This is a beautiful subversion of their previously established relationship, as well as the dynamics of most male protagonists and their female love interests. This fate, well, I would say it's quite similar to Curly. Now, Mr. Rochester was the abuser in his situation, and Curly was the compliant bystander, but the end result is the same. They're both left disabled, unable to take care of themselves, and it is the woman who takes up that job, thus giving them the power in the situation instead of the man. Except, sadly, in the case of Mouthwashing, the man steals the power right back. Jimmy demeans Anya's skills as a nurse and eventually takes her role over completely. It's a subversion of a subversion, meaning it's the norm. The man has control. For so many women, this is the reality. So we can't shy away from it or say we're making it all about gender. Because women deserve better. Because men already made it about gender. Workplace sexual harassment is embarrassingly prevalent. I cannot pronounce that word for some reason. According to one study that I found in AAUW.org, 34% of women said they've been sexually harassed at the workplace. 34%. Women just like Anya. This is why we need things like the Me Too movement. And for those that bemoan it and feminism as a whole, just know you're pathetic and I hate you. Now, out of the 34%, how many do you think had bystanders? Men that didn't exactly agree with the behavior, but still let it slide because, wow, men will be men. Boys will be boys. I can't just turn in my friend, can I? How many lives could be saved if we stop pretending this is normal and okay? So, is Curly a bad person? Are men in general usually bad? That's for you to answer. But what I can't say is that if you were replaced with someone more compassionate and honestly just someone more competent, Anya would not have died. None of the crew would have. Curly didn't crash the Tulpar, but he, even if indirectly, led to its untimely demise. Anya is great, isn't she? Such a strong character for such a tragic story. And when she took her own life, my heart broke. Again, this was preventable. It's interesting to note that her text color is the same as Polly at the end of the game. They both play the role of watching Jimmy, wanting him to take responsibility for what he did. Her name in Nigerian, I believe, seems to translate to eye, as like an all-seeing eye. This pairs with the OST cover art of Anya putting a contact lens in. A contact lens into her eye. I saw a video from Risley right here on YouTube that from Anya's perspective, she told Curly she was pregnant, and then he crashed the ship. What went through her mind after that, well, only God himself knows. And yet, God has abandoned the crew. We even see it in the release date trailer.
I see it so clearly. Through the crack in the wall. Behind God's back. Telecolored, electric and constant. We're already here.
Behind God's back. All of this suffering is happening, and he doesn't even know about it. From the onset, we can see Anya is rather anxious, is what I would say, but as many comments I've seen have pointed out already, we are seeing her primarily through the eyes of her abuser, morphing her perspective on her as a person. And we also have to account for the fact that, well, she just doesn't want to be around him, for very, very obvious reasons. When Anya is talking to Curly in all of the flashbacks, She seems more sure of herself, and importantly, much more comfortable and expressive. She tells him about Jimmy's inappropriate comments that are disguised as jokes, to which of course Curly does nothing about, but it goes to show that Anya felt confident enough to, for all intents and purposes, to file an official complaint. So, no, it's not that she's an anxious person, it's just that she is anxious around her abuser, and that we see the story through his eyes. I've seen it theorized that the reason Anya can't give Curly his painkillers is because, well, it reminds her of Jimmy, specifically his assault on her. The sounds Curly gives off, well, I don't have to spell it out to you, how that would remind her of this assault. If this section seems a bit disjointed, it's because it is. And I find it to be incredibly interesting and incredibly tragic. I've already talked about Anya a lot in other sections, and in future sections I will be talking about her, but I thought she deserved her own section nonetheless. And now that I'm actually writing it, I find that I actually have very little to say. Because while there's little details here and there that we can pick up on, I'm more interested in the meat of this story, not the toppings. And with Anya, there just isn't a lot of that. And I honestly think that's intentional. The framing of the story always shows the perspective of the men. They are in control of the narrative. They have the power. And this is a disgusting reality of even the current day. We view mouthwashing not through the mind's eye of Anya, but through either her abuser or the bystander. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a really good anime. A great one even. So much so that I covered it on the channel already. And in that video, we took a look at the male gaze. I never promised not to do that thing that I'm pretty sure people don't like, but that helps me make these videos, and include an excerpt from other videos I made. So here is a relatively brief one discussing the male gaze. However, the difficulty arises in what the male gaze does to women internally. It becomes almost a second personality, one that observes and silently judges the behavior of any said woman. We take so much from art. We are influenced by it. When you constantly have men portraying the lives of women, those women in the audience, especially from a young formative age, are going to accept that this is how womanhood should be, internalizing that, and thus the male gaze is born. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off subverts the manic pixie dream girl. Honestly, even the original comic seems to do so as well, but the anime especially does this by directly telling us Ramona's story. However, I wouldn't necessarily say it subverts the male gaze, as it is ultimately written and even directed by men, namely Brian Lee O'Malley, the original Scott Pilgrim creator, Ben David Grabinski, and was directed by Abel Gongoro. At the end of the day, it can only go so far as to subvert the male gaze when it is written by men. But men can certainly be pro-feminist in their art, so it's a sticky situation. I still have to give them props for making such a Ramona Flowers-focused story and anime, while also recognizing the importance of women writers while writing women. But hey, I'm just a guy explaining to you what the male gaze is. Why take my word for it? Again, it's a relatively simple concept to understand, the male gaze, but it's very hard to actually combat. Not to get political, but I've seen many men specifically when talking about the most recent US election say rather distasteful things to and about women who voted openly for Trump. And like, I certainly get it, I hate Trump too, but let's take a step back for a second. As a man, I outright don't think it's your place to make such comments. But at the same time, we can recognize the internalized oppression many women face, so much so that it shapes their very opinions. I personally think Trump is a bad thing for women on many different fronts, some more obvious than others, and yet, women still voted for him. And the vast majority had what they at least believed to be a good reason for doing that, even though I disagree with them, but a loud minority are openly anti-feminist. I believe the term is trad wife, someone who believes very strongly in traditional gender roles. And this is where it gets complex, friends, because I believe everyone should live the life they want. And if being a traditional stay-at-home mom to a family of 5, the dog included of course, makes someone happy, then I'm all for it. Who am I to say, especially as a man, that they're wrong for that? But we have to acknowledge here that they are raised in a society that tells them that's who they should be. So much so that their very desires are completely molded around that ideal. I think this very beautifully circles back to cyberpunk edge runners, and David Martinez specifically. And now it's time for more excerpts. Sorry, LOL. I promise it's for a good reason. Oh yeah, and skip to this timestamp to avoid edge runner spoilers. And yet, despite the choices he made, he still ended up in that cyberskeleton anyway, because often there are external factors that go beyond our control. Faraday's power-hungry attitude just can't be accounted for in David's plans. Yes, David always could have just walked away, and the show is clearly trying to tell us that he should have, but to call him stupid for not doing so would be missing the point. Those external factors beyond our control, they're what shape us. In a way, we kind of are those factors. Even Faraday, who serves as the final external wrench in David's life and ultimately his doom, is himself a man completely influenced by the external factors around him that are beyond his control. Edgerunners goes out of its way to show how different he is from the actual corpos. How his desperate scramble for wealth and power is compared to the relaxed, honestly indifferent attitude of the corpos who are actually in power. They see Faraday as nothing more than a dog, just as Faraday sees David. If he had been born into different circumstances, his entire attitude here would be completely different. He also wouldn't even be Faraday. In this way, Faraday himself is kind of this desperate scramble. So again, we have to apply the same logic to David. He does have a choice, yes, but any choice he does make almost completely hinges on everything in his life that came before. The dreams of his mom in Maine, his disregard for his own life, his anatomy that makes him able to handle cyberware at a high level, his love for Lucy, and most importantly, the place he was born, Night City. There are no happy endings here because there were never any happy beginnings. To me, that is the biggest tragedy of edge runners. Seeing David at the top of Arasaka Tower, shifting in and out of full-blown cyberpsychosis, smiling and exclaiming to his mom that he finally made it there, to the very top of Arasaka. He never needed a dream, he just needed a path. This climb up the corporate ladder had been repeated to him over and over by his mother, to the point where it was ingrained into his very soul. He just never realized it until these final moments, if he ever really did. But this is Night City, and he's a slum kid. The system never had a way for someone like him to make it to the top of that tower from the inside. No, perhaps this was the only way. Perhaps this was the only way he would ever be able to climb this tower, predetermined by his mother's one and dying wish since the day he was born, from the outside. It's a beautifully tragic moment, because as we've discussed, the most devastating parts of oppression are internal. Believing that your life has no value, pursuing goals unconsciously forced upon you by others, whole groups of people putting themselves down for committing crime and violent acts, even though it was the grander system that instilled this into them to begin with. It's much more nuanced than that. Not to sound like a cliche here, but you can leave Night City, but Night City won't leave you. Not so easily. Self-eternalized oppression, obviously caused by external oppression, is much, much harder to rid yourself of, especially when a lot of it is thought to be the result of intergenerational trauma in many respected groups of thought. It's all getting quite complex, isn't it? My grander point here is that any dreams or desires one may have are ultimately derived from external influence, and society's influence more specifically. A trad wife may want to fulfill a traditional gender role, but she only wants to do that most likely because that's what she's been taught to want, because of the male gaze, that internalized second self. Of course, we do need to draw a line here, even I realize that. We must understand these concepts, but this long, long road does inevitably ask the question, well, what even are you then? Do you have free will? And to answer that, I'd recommend going to watch all of my Doki Doki Literature Club videos, as I won't be distracting from the thesis of this video and talking about them. God knows I've already talked about it enough on the channel. When discussing the male gaze, I think the best example I always give is Dante's Divine Comedy, and the character of Beatrice specifically, an angelic figure meant to guide and thus save Dante. And Beatrice was actually a person in real life, at least it's theorized she existed. And Dante supposedly only met her on 2 occasions, yet became so in love with her he wrote multiple works based around her, and included her in the end of Purgatorio and in the entirety of Paradiso, which says a lot about Dante, but we won't be opening that can of worms today. This, to me, is the ultimate example of the male gaze. It is a man who immortalized the story of a woman, creating art around her that would go on to influence what other girls and women desired and thought of themselves. He taught them what love should be through his eyes, and gave them no opportunity to use their own minds to figure it out for themselves. I said this in my college thesis paper on my favorite novel ever, After Image, but I'll say it again here. The history of art is the history of the subjugation of women. We as people look to stories to tell us who we should be, what we should want. We look at fictional characters and try to model ourselves after them at a very young age. We are read bedtime stories as kids of a knight saving a princess, played romantic music, shown beautiful paintings of love, all crafted through the hands of a man. Thankfully, times have changed and women are slowly gaining more power and influence and creating more art, but that stuff still has a way of sticking. Maybe you weren't told those kind of bedtime stories as a child, but your parents sure were, and their parents, and their parents, and so on and so forth. Centuries of subjugation isn't suddenly just erased, as there is a shared lineage of oppression passed down by men, and even by other women. Anya is a victim of this. The game intentionally doesn't really give her the spotlight. It morphs her opinion of her as a shy and timid girl based entirely on Jimmy's opinion of her. She was a victim of sexual assault, which, voiceover note here, is basically what the story is mostly about, and yet we never really get to see her journey through that. Just glimpses. And again, I think that's intentional. That the game is trying to draw attention to this and make us ask ourselves why we can't simply write a section in a video essay strictly about Anya and the game's story, and instead go on a tirade about the male gaze in an anime that has nothing to do with mouthwashing. And don't worry, friends, because the meta commentary of this video gets even deeper. As you've heard me talk about the male gaze, you've probably forgotten the fact that I too am a man, piecing together the story of a woman. As I said, I have absolutely no place to tell women how to live their lives. And yet, here I am telling you about all of this, trying to influence your opinion. Quite a contradiction, isn't it? Well, we've made it to the end of another video. Like I said, this is a snippet of a much, much larger mouthwashing analysis. And if you liked this video and want to see more, please go watch the video in the end card. And if you already watched that larger video and watched this one just to support, I do greatly appreciate it. This is all for marketing purposes. Yay for being a YouTuber. And as always, thank you for watching.